Hello everyone, my name is Rupali and I am very excited to part of this wonderful webinar on renewable fuels in international context. This has been part of REM USA in September. Unfortunately, I wasn't there, but I heard from my colleagues that it was a great discussion about renewable fuels, and this time we are going to have this webinar just before REM Asia in April and again REM USA, just to see what are the updates now on the fuels and what has happened, and again bring in the topic into limelight basically. And today, like, I am joined by some in renewable fuel field, like Sam from Molecules Group, Bailey from RTC, and Izzat from 3 Degrees. So we are going to have a very good discussion today. And just a little bit about the Center for Resource Solution where I work at. And if some of you are not aware of who are we are a nonprofit organization. We have been around for more than 29 years, and we create market solutions for policy and for sustainable energy. And we have various work streams to that. One of that is our policy work stream, where we provide guidance on carbon accounting as well as rec accounting, and also guidance on like how voluntary market or regulatory market interact with each other. We have several interesting projects there, but the really interesting one for the fuel, recently we had clean energy accounting project. You can go on CRS website and look at it. This project highlights the market-based tools for carbon accounting of like various uh, renewable fuels, and it's a really interesting project. And you can be in touch with CRS if you have any questions. We also have several like expert assistance project. We also do two conferences, so we are into the education world as well. As just now I mentioned, like we had REM USA in September, and again we are going to have REM Asia in April, and then again in September REM USA in Washington DC. And but apart from all this, we are really known for the Greenie certification program. I think you all would have heard about energy certification a lot, but we have some other programs also, and like carbon offsets, renewable fuels, etc. So basically, we are a global leader in voluntary market renewable electricity certification. It's a, as I mentioned, it's kind of voluntary market certification. It's different than treasury or tracking. Basically, provides consumer protection, and we have, I think, certified more than 140 million megawatt hours of US renewable energy, renewable electricity in 2025, and the graph has been rising, and every year it's more and more. So it's very interesting and good certification program. And as I mentioned, not only in electricity world, we are also there in renewable fuels, carbon offsets, etc. We launched our Greeny Renewable Fuels program in 2021, and the idea was like to accelerate the adoption of uh, and you drive voluntary market demand for various fuels, not like only one candidate. But currently, we have only one renewable fuel candidate in our program, that's renewable natural gas. And we will hear a lot about RNG. I think Bailey is here. She's an expert in RNG. Sam has been working with RNG and now various kind of molecules. And of course, perspective on Asia from 3 degrees from Izzat. So under this program, we have various participants type. Currently, we have 3 participants: NU Climate, STX, US Energy. As I mentioned, that it's new program and it's growing, but we have some facilities, but it's not listed and cannot be revealed what are the facilities. But if anyone is interested, can contact me to know more detail about this program. And we also offer like various products type, etc. And the plan is also to enhance this program and include more and more renewable fuel molecules in the future. Next is going to be renewable hydrogen. We have put our draft out of the standard and waiting for the second public stakeholder comment period to get over. And after that, this year for renewable hydrogen, we will have one working standard out, and I'm pretty excited about it. And also maybe have a small survey on hunting the new candidate based on the market demands, interests, etc. So those are the new things happening under Greeny Renewables Fuels program. Just to put like little limelight on the program, or what is it? So it's basically currently it's not international program. It's only in US and Canada. We have several requirements, creditability requirement, for example, like regulatory surplus is required, and no RINs or LCFS credits for the same decatherm can be sold in Greeny certified transaction. Uh, It requires like various verifications, audits, as I told, like I'll be very happy to discuss in detail. And here you can see a summary that we have like four main kind of requirements. We have requirements on the production pathways from the feedstock side, then carbon intensity side, fuel production vintage side, and we do not have any strict requirements or anything from facility age and location side. Just before I end and pass it to Sam, I would like to highlight the standard is not something that CRS sets it. It's approved, it's a rigorous process. It involves two public stakeholder comment period, lot of knowledge input, and then it is approved by a Greeny governance board, which is a group of NGOs like Southern Environmental Law Centers or Union of Concerned Scientists, etc. A lot of people are part of that board, and only then it is approved. And I'll pass it to Sam and see you all later for our discussions on renewable fuels.
Thank you, Rupali. Thanks, Rupali, and thanks, CRS, for hosting and inviting me to be part of this discussion today. My name is Sam Lehr. I'm the co-founder and executive vice president of policy at a firm called Molecule Group that operates as an international convener of stakeholders across sustainable fuels, chemicals, and materials technologies. Appreciate the opportunity again to share our perspective today, and looking forward to hearing from some of the other speakers about how you're viewing Asian markets for sustainable fuels. Next slide, please. So first, just a little bit about Molecule Group. As I mentioned, we're a global cross-technology convener of molecular technologies that was created to fill really a few gaps in the policy landscape. So I always like to say that there are already a lot of very good advocacy organizations out there, but most cover technology specific and often regionally specific issues. So we created Molecule Group to bring these voices together to solve common areas of overlap, to really create an international community of practice for sustainable fuels. Our thesis involves working to accomplish this in two ways. The first is that we work closely with quasi-governmental organizations like the Clean Energy Ministerial, the G7, G20 COP, and International Energy Agency. And that includes facilitating input from our stakeholder groups into their processes. This allows us to cover the high level. The second way we do this is that we convene work streams around specific topics, which provide opportunities to solve those policy issues where there's areas of overlap at a more detailed level. So two of the topics, they're listed here on the slide, but I'll just highlight these because I think they're the most relevant to our conversation. The first is ILUC, where we're building consensus around the best way to address ILUC, which is called indirect land use change. This is extremely important to ensuring that sustainable biofuels and products are scaled in a responsible way, including in the Asian context. Second, we're also looking to develop a framework that makes life cycle carbon accounting more compatible with corporate accounting frameworks like the GHG protocol and SBTI. So just to give you a couple examples of what we're working on. Next slide, please, Rupali. So this slide is just really another way to illustrate how we view the flow of information from Molecule Group stakeholders into the international processes. And I'll use this just as an opportunity to highlight one of our key initiatives that I think both illustrates our work and will help in the framing of today's conversation, and that is the BELEM Commitment for Sustainable Fuels, otherwise known as the BELEM 4X Pledge, which came out of the COP30 in November. So BELEM 4X aims to build high-level political support for the quadrupling of sustainable fuels globally. This is based on data from the International Energy Agency that shows under current policies we can reach 4X based on roughly today's numbers. And of course, this was launched by the Brazilian COP president, but notably, initial signatories of the pledge include Italy, India, and Japan. So this really showcases Asia's commitment to the topic of sustainable fuels. Our organization, Molecule Group, supported the Brazilian government in standing up this initiative, including our submittal of the Sustainable Industries Letter to the COP30 presidency. And we included a few policy priorities in our letter, which were then well reflected in the pledge. And again, I'll just highlight these because they're relevant to the conversation. This includes aligning domestic and international carbon accounting frameworks, coordinating on those topics, and accelerating international trade of sustainable fuels. So again, all points that will be necessary in developing a pathway to the deployment of sustainable fuels and feedstocks at scale. That just gives you a flavor of kind of how Molecule Group views the world and our approach to these topics. So thanks again. With that, I'll turn it over to Bailey.
Thanks so much, Sam. And hi, everyone. It is such a pleasure to join today. Thanks to CRS for inviting me to share on behalf of the RTC, the Renewable Thermal Collaborative. So I'm a project and research director leading work on RNG for the RTC. I also lead work on geothermal and manage things like case studies and webinars. So what is the RTC? The RTC is a global coalition of organizations committed to decarbonizing thermal energy use through renewable heating and cooling technology. So our primary focus is tackling scope 1 for industrial heat users. And we do that by working on the tech side, on market development issues, and in the policy sphere to give folks the tools they need to make clean heat projects happen. So we convene both the buy and supply side, so off-takers and tech implementers, and our members represent more than 6 trillion in market capitalization. So my perspectives on this call will mostly be RNG centric and focused on voluntary procurement in terms of supply and demand. So the RTC is tech agnostic, and RNG is just one of the paths to decarbonization that we work on at the organization. You can see other work streams up here. We have regular convenings for this working group, these working groups, as well as community calls, buyer-supplier connect sessions, and a ton of online public resources like vision reports on different technologies and for different sectors, case studies on usage, including some RNG ones. We have like a green gas one we did recently and an AstraZeneca one as well. And we have an annual summit in Washington, D.C. that is going to be in October. WWF and C2ES also have staff who are dedicated to working on the RTC's goals, including my colleague Sahang Yuan, who runs the market-based accounting working group. And she will be at REM Asia, I believe, speaking on GHG accounting and scope 3. So look out for Sahang if you're planning to attend REM Asia. So this next slide gives you an example of like an idea of our partners on the buy side. So these are our members. So as you can see, spans a lot of different industries, varying like applications for RNG. And the slide after showcases our technology providers. We call them solutions providers. So just to give you an idea, there's a lot of like RNG suppliers in here as well. So with that brief intro of the RTC done, I'll hand it to Izzat.
Thanks, Bailey, and thanks CRS team for inviting me to speak on this webinar. So my name is Izzat. I lead 3 Degrees' Asia Pacific origination and wholesale business across our suite of solutions. So we are a environmental commodities market participant covering activities on project development, wholesale trading, sourcing origination, and even advisory, right? So if we go to the next slide, so 3 Degrees, we have been in the business since 2022. So we claim to be one of the OGs in the environmental commodity space. Our headquarters is in San Francisco, but since last year, we have increased our global footprint to include Singapore. So I'm here based in sunny Singapore, so if you have any queries around the markets, feel free to reach out to me. But as you can see, we are quite widely dispersed across the world. Most of our activities around the renewable natural gas and RTCs is definitely in the US and in Europe, but we do see Asia being the next up and coming market for low carbon fuels, biomethane, renewable natural gas in various modalities that if you can imagine at this stage still determining what is the best modality for the market to scale up. If you could go on to the next stage. Next slide. Yes. So here is just a quick summary of the work we do. Essentially, we provide solutions across Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 to end clients, addressing topics around managing their emissions reduction strategy through the purchase of carbon credits. We take a role as a carbon developer as well to address some of those requirements. At the same time, in the topic of for today would be the RNG RTC space. So we do work with quite a number of global MNCs that have taken the first leap to utilizing RTCs and RNG as part of the Scope 1 reduction. We also cover quite a fair bit on Scope 2, and this has been a bit of the origin story of 3 Degrees, in which we are one of the global leaders of the global EACs market in North America, in Europe, where we trade GOs, as well as in Asia and the rest of the world. Typically, that's what we'll be trading IREX. We see a strong interest to look into various sources of Scope 2 solutions, in which bio-based would be one of those interesting areas that we could discuss further on. And of course, last but not least, Scope 3 solutions would really look into focusing on the supplier or supply chain decarbonization, of which the end customer Scope 1 and 2, the supply chains, Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions would contribute to the customers or end customer Scope 3 emissions. So this is where they are interestingly looking at various solutions to help meet their targets. Next couple of slides is just to highlight the clients and the partners that we work with. Some of these names have expressed interest, and we have worked together with them to drive adoption of biomethane and RTCs as part of their decarbonization journey. Albeit still early days, and we do expect quite a number of these logos here and a lot more to consider adopting RNG and RTC as part of your decarb strategy moving forward. And yeah, this last slide just highlights the memberships that we are part of interest for today would be some of the biogas and renewable gas associations that we are part of. Certainly cementing our commitment towards driving the adoption of the product and catalyzing this market in areas where we see huge potential, particularly in Asia.
Thank you, Izzat, Bailey, and Sam for introducing and your work streams, etc. And I'll be very happy to start our discussion on renewable fuels, and maybe starting with Sam, since you are working at Molecules Group at like various molecules. So if we talk about like the near-term solutions, what are the fuel candidates you see emerging from like lab to market as near-term solutions?
Yeah, thanks, Rupali. I think it's a pretty big question, and it's dependent on where we're looking. So maybe I can answer that with respect to a few of the areas in Asia that we're a little bit more tuned into. So India in particular, we see a pretty big opportunity for biogas. India currently has, so I was able to pull some stats from one of the IEA reports, and they currently have 170 operational facilities. You compare that to the US currently has over 550 for compressed biogas, which is essentially the same thing as RNG. And their biogas potential is higher than ours. So they could increase 7x by 2030. Less than 5% of their total potential is used today. So we think biogas in India is a really big deal. We work with some of the associations there as well. So it's something that we're tracking closely.
About USA, I think your perspective, since you are in States, and about the
Yeah,
US
sure.
will be better, right?
Certainly, yeah. And I think same for the US. So biogas everywhere is strong. Um, I think we're also looking a lot more at the e-fuels pathways, and we're thinking a lot about how you can turn, say, a methane molecule into another molecule. So there's certain biogas to SAF pathways that are very interesting. We definitely see SAF as one of the kind of big deal renewable fuels that's still up and coming, although it seems to have stagnated a little bit, at least in terms of just the like all of the excitement around it over the past couple of years. I think same thing with hydrogen. And again, happy to talk a little bit more about what we're seeing in the Asian markets, but for now, we're really focused on renewable gases. We're focused on, how do we get the carbon accounting right for some of the classic liquid fuels, and then what are kind of the next sectors like aviation and maritime that are important.
Yeah, I definitely see RNG being important, and I think Izzat will have more info about the Asian market, and I'll be happy to know your perspective, Izzat. But like you highlighted India, and I would like to add one thing I did not know, I did not check any number. In India, even at smaller scale, RNG is being used. Like when I went to school in India, I did my schooling in India, and even all the shared transportation system, like buses, I'm telling, like, years ago were running on natural gas. So they have the system ready. They just need to switch it to the renewable natural gas. I have also witnessed a lot of small biogas plants, like in people's gardens, etc. So it's really interesting, and I was really uh, not surprised to know your opinion on that market. And Izzat, would you like to highlight about like other Asian countries? What are the more trending fuels?
Yeah.
What do you think like which will be the next near-term solutions?
Cool. I think thanks, Pali, for segueing to Asia. So maybe my focus would probably be in the Southeast Asian region. I think that's a bit where you see a lot of activity and traction there. And I think this is something which we could touch on something a bit contentious, right? The reason being is in Southeast Asia, the predominant potential feedstock for bio-based fuels would be palm-based, right? So palm oil. And certainly we're looking at about 70-80% of total supply of palm oil coming from two countries, right? Indonesia and Malaysia, right? This is again the ballpark stats of my mind. And of course, there are very mature supply chains around, treating waste, around managing, palm oil residues, both liquid residues as well as solid residues. And in aggregate, this provides a very, interesting potential for valorization. And of course, in terms of both gaseous as well as liquid fuels, right? So we're looking at palm-based um, mill effluent, right? So we call it here POME, POME, palm oil mill effluent, in which you would see biogas capture units installed in situ, capturing the biogas, and the traditional way of which this is then utilized for power generation to run the mill or the local operations. But given the kind of, as Sam mentioned, the end demand markets that has taken a bit of a growth trajectory. You would have maritime demand, you'd have power demand, you'd have chemicals and fuels demand. And you see that the direction in which the biogas is going towards is through upgrading into biomethane. And this becomes a very interesting source of feedstock, right? So in short, the short-term workhorse for Asia, I believe, would be biomethane from agri-waste streams, of which a large chunk of it would be from the palm sector. However, we do note that there are many other next sectors, right? For example, you have a large swine and other livestock sectors, right? Primarily swine and not so much cattle, and this would form good sources. For example, centralized manures in which biogas extractions can happen and then upgrading to biomethane, right? And there are also other agricultural crops. For example, you have in Thailand, you have large sources of cassava. Typically this goes through a wastewater treatment process, and a lot of methane is produced in some of these facilities. There are also a sizable amount of sugar, right? Sugar processing and facilities, and this also has got a sizable amount of biogas waste that can potentially be valorized, right? So these are essentially the areas in which feedstock supply could come from in Asia, and I'm going to put my bet on that it will remain so, right? So palm will remain to be the large source of biofuel feedstock in the foreseeable future, especially when there are alternatives towards the consumption of edible oils in the market.
Thank you, Izzat. I'll be like come back to RNG again. Like it's interesting and a lot of boom in USA, and you are telling biomethane will be interesting. Apart from other palm oil based fuels in Asia, maybe Bailey, you will have better perspective. Like what makes it better than other fuels, and do you see like RNG, how it compares? Will it provide, will it compete with hydrogen now, considering 45V in the near term market? And will it be like helpful in decarbonizing heavy duty transportation or other industrial sectors as well?
That's a great question. And at the RTC, we do have different work streams on different technologies. And one of the most important things for us is helping our members and solutions providers understand like where each technology is best deployed. So I'm not best suited for the comparison, but I can tell you why like I'm excited about RNG and why it fits so well into our work. So it's not largely used at an industrial scale in the Asia Pacific region, but there is a lot of high potential for industry globally. So as Izzat and I think Sam has already touched on, there are a variety of different waste streams that can be leveraged, many of which are really high potential in the region, especially like palm oil was mentioned, agricultural, livestock. Industries are very big, so I think that with supply chain buildup, there's a lot of potential there. But the cool thing about RNG for industrial applications is that it can meet temperatures of almost up to almost 2000 degrees Celsius. So it's very viable for high temperature applications that can be harder to decarbonize with things like electrification. And all the existing fossil natural gas equipment and delivery construct infrastructure is compatible with RNG. So there are minimal to no equipment upgrades to make in that regard. So we're hearing from a lot of our C&I customers, as 2030 goals loom, it can be really difficult to install an industrial heat pump. And if you're looking to meet your decarbonization goals, RNG is a way to do that without like one of our members refer to it as performing open heart surgery on your facility, which can be really, really cumbersome. And you can do it without a lot of like, without really significant downtime or because like production downtime is huge. So the demand comes from C&I customers. That's what we're really focused on, but there's also use for it from utilities, the transportation sector. I think Sam can probably speak more to that. But I think there's a lot of RNG for industrial demand, and that's also super important as like there's a lot of rapidly industrializing like need in this region, and RNG could meet a lot of those decarbonization goals for companies that have operations there.
Thank you, Bailey. And I think Sam will also have opinion on this, what I'm going to ask next, or you, Bailey. I know that the cost is the biggest or one of the main barriers for scale up or, for the deployment of RNG. But apart from cost, like what are the maybe enablers or barriers you both see for RNG world?
Do you want to go first, babe?
I can. I think that, I think the key, and this is definitely I think a lot of these are global trends that are maybe exacerbated in Asia because it's a more nascent market. But I think one of the really big keys is going to be supply chain development. So on the RNG side, there are some incentives in the region for like smaller scale anaerobic digestion, which would probably, I think you talked about a bit in India. But we're not seeing the kind of production that results in like industrial scale commercialization of RNG production. And so there's the production piece, and then there's the transport and the dissemination. And Izzat, I think you touched on the fact that with palm oil, which like, mixed feelings. I love the orangutans. There's a really difficult like that's a more built out supply chain, but there isn't that so much on the supply and production and transport and dissemination side for other industries. So there's a long way to go on feedstocks and infrastructures and also understanding demand. So downstream customers or off-takers can send signals to encourage manufacturers to adopt more renewable fuels through a demand signal. And, whether that's in like convenings like ours or through their procurements, but then it gets into a bit of a chicken and the egg in terms of understanding what the demand is while trying to meet it with supply. I think that so in addition to supply chain, I think there's also like the infrastructure of tracking, but I think we'll probably get into that later. And before I keep going, Sam, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Bailey. No, I think it's a great answer, and I was going to essentially say the same thing as you, which is supply chain. And I think with our partners that we talk to in India, they are very excited about the biogas sector, but it's sort of all of the kind of biomass based feedstock, fuels, chemicals, materials all face this challenge of collecting the feedstock and processing it efficiently, right? And if you think about where the US is now, for example, we have pretty strict landfill rules that have caused us to have, I mean, essentially every landfill have a cover, have a flaring system, right? We're slowly, I guess you could say, in some ways, wanting to move toward dedicated food waste digesters. At least I think that's the future that we're wanting to head toward, but that's a long way off here. My understanding of, for example, the Indian biogas landscape, which again it is the very, very large potential market in Asia. My understanding is that it's still different landfill engineering technologies, and I think some of the developers that are global players will have a whole different set of challenges to face there as they're building out the technology.
What about maybe is that you will uh, be happy to answer this. What about the barriers for like even palm oil based fuels or biomethane, etc. in Asia region? You think like it's like Sam mentioned, okay, some rules are pretty strict here. Maybe those are like enablers there rather than barriers. And what is your opinion on those?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, Rupali. I think both Bailey and Sam has covered a lot on the supply chain and aggregation as well as the inland logistics to move that feedstock towards downstream valorization. Now, I'll touch a bit on something that probably on the commercial side we do see. Firstly, it's the potential conflation of two worlds, right? You would have your agricultural sector in an area which typical plantation owners in palm, for example, aren't exactly very familiar with the energy markets, or in another markets where demand for products in maritime, aviation, or power is such the case, right? They have been typically looking at transacting on a spot basis. And so the contracts and the familiarity of taking risk is going to be a bit more different, right? When they enter into this new world of valorizing their waste streams into another and selling them into a market that you're not familiar with. Now, on the flip side, you'd have, for example, the power sector, or who's very much used towards signing long-term fossil-based gas contracts, right? And now they say, okay, we have an opportunity to take in biomethane as a drop-in, right, without changing much infra, but you will have to be, negotiating on our terms now. So I do see a near-term issue around the mitigating the risks between contracts and how the supplier, i.e., a palm oil company or someone in the agri space, and having to have these negotiations with a utility or an end customer that has not traditionally looked at securing feedstock from the agri sector, right? So that's one. Two, and because of that, the nature of waste crops is not stable, right? We're looking at having a lot of seasonality, having a lot of exogenous factors, natural factors that can affect yield of the crops. And we know waste is a derivative of the primary production, right? So you only get waste if your crops grow and your utilization of your mills hit a certain base load. And we see contracts that utilities are used towards a put or pay, right? There is a minimum volume that's required, otherwise there are penalties imposed. So this becomes a bit of a challenge in terms of how the two worlds could meet and have some form of understanding in terms of managing risk collectively, and understanding that, hey, this is going to be a catalytic move towards enabling upstream parties to see there are more than just your traditional, FMB markets for palm oil, but there's also this potential energy markets. But there needs to be this understanding both ways. So to me, I think that's one next hurdle that the market needs to come together and solve for, in order for this to scale.
What again, I think this will be like Bailey and Sam because we can discuss about USA. What about the policy mechanisms in USA? You see, those have been very helpful for like not even USA market or global market, and then we'll come to Asia.
Sure. Thanks for probably. I can go first, Bailey. In the US, we've had so much success on building up biofuels out of the transportation sector incentive programs. So RFS, the renewable fuel standard at the federal level, and state level low carbon fuel standards, with California being the leader there. Um, it's been tremendously successful. The downside is that we don't see a lot of sustainable fuels flowing into other markets, or feedstocks for that matter, to make bio-based chemicals, bio-based materials. So I think while on one hand you can say, there's a lot to learn for markets that are developing new policies, right? In terms of standardizing carbon accounting rules, making sure that there's like third-party verification, quality assurance programs that work well, making sure that procurement infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and chain of custody models are consistent. I think those are all things that have resulted in a lot of success in the US, and potentially even more so in Europe. They're definitely the leaders in developing the policy mechanisms. But on the other hand, I would say, if we could go back and do it all over again, maybe we'd want to create something that isn't as so targeted in the transportation sectors. Now, we say that knowing that politics is the art of the possible, right? And we do what we can, and there are a number of up and coming policies that would support thermal decarbonization, for example, from liquid and gaseous sustainable fuels. But we can maybe get in that a little bit more later if you want. So I think that's kind of how we view the successes of the US market, but also maybe some lessons learned where it's not perfect and things have become a bit siloed.
That's true, actually, when you were telling, like, I'm noticing like all the programs, if you talk about it's mainly transportation centric, yeah. Do you have anything to add to it, Bailey? Like any thought on the policy mechanism in states and any thought on this?
Yes, I'll just add something briefly that's a little bit of a preview of the RTC's forthcoming um, Asia thermal decarbonization report that focuses on India and China. So that's going to be coming out in like April. And if you catch Sahang at REM Asia, I'm sure she can talk to you more about it. She's the lead on that. But basically, we have a couple different like policy routes that we recommend for accelerating momentum across industrial decarbonization technologies, but for especially for renewable fuels. And they include setting targets and introducing policies to support adoption of renewable fuels, establishing frameworks to streamline actions, and incentivizing investments through tax breaks, grants, and loans. And the third one, tax breaks, grants, and loans, is more like government policy centric, but the policies and the frameworks are something that can, be I think at least in part influenced by like industry stakeholders right now. And so I think that, just to give a shout out to Sam's initiative at the Molecule Group, the Impact Accounting Work Stream, and CRS's Clean Energy Accounting Program Project. A lot of acronyms. I think there's some really excellent work happening right now on ensuring accountability of renewable fuels, and I'd love to see the sorts of standards that these like really smart folks are working on be adopted across national borders because that makes it easier for those trying to procure RNG to make less, to manage their risk and make impactful investments.
That brings to next perfect question for Izzat, basically. So I think since US or Europe policy mechanisms are already mature, there is already a lot of compliance market and voluntary market, etc. Do you think that Asia can learn some lessons, like Sam was mentioning? Okay, it was transport centric, and you think it's going in that direction, or Asia is like adapting to totally different ways of seeing it, and how is it there?
I think it's a great question. I think there's definitely going to be a lot of learning points Asia can take from Europe and the US, right?
Yeah.
I think in terms of, let's not reinvent the wheel for the sake of doing so. There are mature structures, registries that can be adopted and deployed in terms of recognizing the unit that's being traded between national borders and the likes. However, I think one thing to be cognizant of is that the state of the infrastructure in Asia is very different within Asia in itself, right? So we don't have a common homogeneous, economic bloc, say in the Europe, that we could essentially work collaboratively between different countries, and in the US, it's a one big, market with infrastructure that's ready, right? So that's where the creative aspect of trying to find areas for, what can be adopted and what has to be created from scratch is where the policy direction, I assume, should be headed towards, right? So, for example, in Asia, Singapore's looking to be a bit of a price setter in terms of how the biomethane, RNG market is going to look like, largely because we are 97% consuming natural gas for power requirements, and biomethane becomes a natural drop-in, right? So the idea here is couched as it's not only for the sake of green, but it's also, the energy trilemma issue that nations like Singapore is facing, and particularly, unfortunately, the events that have happened of over the past few days have just emphasized the point of needing secure supply of fuels in order for continued operations of a nation. So you have the green aspect, you have the security of supply, and then you have a competitive supply, right? Of which these three aspects will need to be considered in the policy development. And certainly looking at where Asia is today, it's long supply. There's a lot of supply in the market, but where is demand? And of course, there are demand nodes there, and it needs to be a very clear signal from a credible entity that is committed towards purchasing or securing volumes for the long haul, to ensure that suppliers would say, hey, this is real demand that I can start investing into. And of course, the moment the banks come in and say it's investable, it's good to go. And therefore last year, if you're familiar, the Singapore government launched the a biomethane import sandbox, right? To again look into understanding what the opportunities are for biomethane globally that could be supplied into the Singapore power market, right? So that becomes a bit of the policy, um, you know, the policy, the activities that underpin future policies, right? To understand what exactly is the potential, how the pricing mechanisms could work, and of course, Singapore having its internal carbon tax or its own carbon tax that could potentially be conflicting between the use or uptake of low carbon fuels, and potentially even looking at early adopters to benefit from carbon tax savings, should they be able to take in more of such volumes, right? Yeah, so I think that will be a bit more of the policy direction in the near term before we go into a lot more complex, aspects that we see in the US and in Europe, for now.
What about the trade barriers? Like you see tariffs or other sustainability requirements and these things as a trade barriers for Asia.
I think these are certainly risks, right? It's naive to know that, to assume it's free for all. So I think the main risks are when countries decide that they want to use these green attributes for their own decarbonization goals, and limit how much of those molecules get exported, right? So
Yeah.
that's probably one real risk that we see. Secondly, I think most of the value capture is expected to be made within the countries or exporting countries' border. So in theory, there are countries in the region in Southeast Asia that are increasingly looking at diversifying their reliance on imported natural gas, and if they are domestically able to produce biomethane, right, there would be a good reason, or there will be an obvious reason to adopt or utilize those supply domestically, right? So this again it's going to be an interesting evolution of the market, right? There will be cross-border arbitrages, there would be supply chain risks that need to be mitigated. But that being said, I think there will need to be some front movers or first movers that are willing to take some risk, that are committed towards committing to early projects in the long haul, that may be required to pay above what the market price is, in so far as today's cost curves are, to get the market to move, right? And with more supply, with more demand, we see a better liquidity in the market. Then we do think that prices should start to taper off, right, as the supply of biomethane becomes fungible between sources of production.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like that's really important. And I also feel maybe now again Bailey and Sam will have better perspective on that. From USA also, this like trade or export of fuels to other markets like in Europe, you see maybe some kind of barriers, like trade barriers, like tariffs or many other sustainability requirements in other countries. For example, if you want to send something to Europe, you need to get their certification or requirements fulfilled. Do you see these things like going or growing for betterment, or you see these things are hindering the trade?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rupali. Thanks.
It's
I
just getting,
think with the US market now, and maybe we can think like US EU markets,
yeah.
we're just getting to the point where exports are looking more and more interesting, right? So much of the volumes of sustainable fuels have been sucked up by those programs, the federal and state level programs, that now we're just starting to contend with questions about how do we sync tracking, how do we sync greenhouse gas accounting. So they are barriers, and there's a couple of instances in, say, the Union database for biofuels is a big one that we're working on, where um, the EU essentially is creating what could be a shipping fuel market or a biogas derived or renewable gas derived fuel import market. But the barrier there is the lack of synchronization between the tracking systems and the carbon accounting systems. Other than that, I don't think there are barriers yet, but it's all of these transactions, everyone who's involved with this market is thinking about what that looks like next, right? And that's why it's top of mind for, all the work that we're doing. And I'll say too, just to add, we've seen some really interesting deals more recently from the US to Japan in particular for renewable gas exports. Um, there aren't really any market rules that govern that, right? Nothing that's ubiquitous. Um, it's all kind of using the existing infrastructure and piecing something together and meeting some other type of certification that is typically out of the EU, and that works. But eventually, these rules will be created, and we will have to make sure that the lack of coordination doesn't become a barrier. But it's not quite there yet. We're getting there.
Yeah. I think we need to leave at least 10 minutes for question answer. I don't see any question in the chat yet, so please everyone put your question in the chat. In meantime, maybe the last question from you all I can ask. I was thinking what should be our last question or takeaway. I wanted to talk about like what breakthroughs you all think we need for like sustainable fuels being cost competitive, to being like more easily deployed, etc. Like some important breakthrough you think you need. It can be policy, it can be voluntary market certification, it can be like anything. So I would like to know what you all think about. Anyone may who wants to go ahead, Izzat, what do you think in Asia will be the possible?
Maybe I can go first, maybe picking a bit more of a very uniquely Asia situation. So I think I'll summarize the three things we need in three buckets, right? Firstly, I think we need policy and pricing signals that internalize carbon and the carbon price, as well as to reward low carbon intensity fuels, right? So it's a bit of a carrot and stick thing. The second thing is having the necessary infrastructure, both soft and hard. I can talk about that a bit, in place, certification and a regional market architecture. And third would be bankable demand, right? So with the first and second points there, when this demand becomes bankable, I think the scaling up will happen in parallel to have some of the corporate leaders to commit towards long-term offtakes. Now, to just briefly articulate and detail out my points, I think the first one, there needs to be this conflation between connecting, carbon price as well as low CI to allow for variation of different feedstock options to enter the market, right? Today, it's still pretty much preliminary, a pass or fail. You either meet or you don't, right? Based on certain standards that Singapore is looking at. But I think having a more detailed look into different feedstock types and CI targets would allow for more supply to enter. The second part on the infrastructure, now we have soft and hard, or physical and soft. So physical, we need more gas grid injection and cluster infrastructure, particularly in regions where we see huge potential, right? So for example, in East Malaysia, or in what we call Kalimantan, right? So it's part in Malaysia, part Indonesia. Massive supply of palm oil products, livestock, waste, other agri-waste. But what's missing is really the infrastructure to connect all these together, right? So we're not really tapping that potential if we don't invest into the infrastructure that enables that. On the soft side, I think this is something that most participants, particularly customers, are very keen to find out more to really understand what can be done, is on the credible certification and tracking systems, right? So today there are many out there in the market. I think you have MRATs, you have iTrack G, amongst those that are looking to push the ante around certifying tracking units that are generated from biomethane facilities. Now, how does this tracking systems integrate with the national registries or national systems that I'm sure export countries or producers want to have their own, in order to make sure that these are firstly not double counted, second, the value of the product is retained within the country in itself. So that's the second part. Now, the third and lastly, I think we mentioned that most of these projects are very capital intensive. They are new from a downstream perspective. It's not new for folks that are currently producing biogas for the longest time, but from the perspective of a tech company looking at investing into the infrastructure or into the fuels, this is new space, right? So there needs to be amount of de-risking required for the likes of big tech, for the likes of major maritime companies looking to say, hey, I want these fuels, but I need to also de-risk it together with my suppliers because this is a new area. They need some form of guarantee that I'm there to take off the volumes, right? So this is where I think to be areas that needs to be addressed. We do see some progress made, but we need to move away from just pilot scale to really commercial sized transactions coming out from Asia. Yeah.
Thank you, Izzat. That's you have covered like really great perspective in all three buckets. I don't know if Bailey and Sam, you have anything to add, especially for like RNG market or any other specific fuel. And we have only one question, and I think I'll have time to take that after that.
I'll just super briefly add, first of all, Izzat, I think what he said was spot on, and I would just go a little slightly deeper into the risk piece, which is I think that clear and defined market boundaries, market-based accounting certainty, and certification program harmonization will go a long way in terms of mobilizing investment and mitigating risk.
Yeah.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with everything that's been said. I mean, Bailey knows that we work on a lot of those issues together, so I totally agree with her. And then Izzat, it's a really insightful and interesting answer. I would just add, and maybe this is taking it even higher level, but so much of our focus broadly in the molecule group convenings revolves around thinking through how we can better standardize carbon accounting and procurement rules globally. And there's a lot of sort of intricacies to that, but in our view, once we can make these markets more fungible and larger and have standardized carbon accounting, not only for the products, but also in the different jurisdictions, so we're not double counting, that's when we'll really see prices come down and the ability to grow the markets like to their fullest potential, really.
Thank you, Sam, Bailey, and Izzat. We had really nice discussion. And I'll move to the question. It's from Daniel Kinzer. He's asking, how does the carbon intensity of biomethane from Southeast Asian and Indian feedstocks, for example, POME and others, compare with biomethane out of North America and EU? I don't know, maybe Izzat has seen the comparison, 3 degrees being at both places, and would like to take it. Have you seen like carbon intensity scores of like different feedstocks, like in USA, in some parts of Asia, Malaysia, and how does it vary? Like, is it too different or?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question, Daniel. I think to caveat, I think firstly a lot of the feedstock analysis done in Southeast Asia has centered around the palm space. So I think there are other sources that have not technically done a further deep dive. For example, biomethane from landfill, right, or biomethane from manure, which from a comparable perspective, this would be similar to what we see in the US and Europe. Now, the reason for relatively higher CI of farm-based biomethane is because of the ILUC, or in our terms here, LULUC, right? Land use change. And this really depends on the full, the plantations, right? How these are being developed or treated over the past 10, 20 years that could impact drastically the CI score of such feedstock.
Thank you, Izzat. I think I do not have any other question, and we are like close to the time, so we finish it on time. And it was really nice discussion, and thank you everyone for joining me today on this. And I think it's already night for some of the USA folks. So have a good night. Bye bye. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Rupali. Thank you,
you.
guys.
Everyone.